Welcome to Unveiling Death. I am Rabbi Jeffrey Weil. That Cosmic Feeling, a conversation with Lee Feinberg. Lee Feinberg has been the telescope manager and lead optical engineer for the James Webb Space Telescope for more than 2 decades. He previously worked on the Hubble Space Telescope. Feinberg plays far-out keyboards with the bands Honeyfunk and the Allman Others. Lee Feinberg, welcome to Unveiling Death.
Thank you.
You, Lee, have spent your career looking into space, really very, very much spaced out. So can you briefly describe what you have done for your career?
Sure. My background is optics and applied physics. And right about the time the Hubble Space Telescope went up in space and they figured out that it had this major optical problem, I got hired by NASA, and I've spent a career working on space telescopes, including the fixes for Hubble and the instruments then that upgraded Hubble. And then I worked on the Webb telescope for 20 years, and was in charge of all the optics in the telescope for Webb through commissioning, and am now starting to work on a new telescope that's going to search for life.
So with the Webb telescope, obviously it's a phenomenal look deep into space, closer than we've ever been to seeing or comprehending in some way the origins of the universe. There's this notion of that Einstein presented of the cosmic religious feeling. And you're a thoughtful scientist, thoughtful in all sorts of ways. And if you work on something so hard and you are really committed to it, and then you behold what you have wanted to, sort of sought to see, and you have like sort of a front row seat in that exploration and that vision. Is this cosmic religious feeling, which I'll describe in a moment, is it a real thing? In other words, is it like something that you have experienced in an emotional, spiritual way, or does it become sort of a quotidian? Your work is your work, and so like most people's work, it becomes a little quotidian, sort of like it's what you do daily. It's just what you do. So let me just describe in part. So the cosmic religious feeling that Einstein described, it arises upon beholding the origins of the universe, which is relevant and characterized in part by, among other things, a sense of the futility of human desires and aims, a sense of being part of a larger whole, a feeling of the vanity of human existence. Those are big things. Have you experienced any of this?
Yeah, I think this is really what has motivated me in life in terms of my career and in terms of my thinking about religion and Judaism. So if I were to go all the way back to what inspired me to do what I do, it's funny because a lot of people I've worked with at NASA, they grew up with the space program, and it was going to the moon inspired them. For me, it was actually, lying on a field at Camp Ramah when I was, in school, and looking up at the stars and just getting this intense feeling about what's out there and how did we get here. I remember one of the reasons I originally wanted to work on Hubble was because it was going to look at, how the universe formed and expanded, et cetera. And then, of course, Webb, it's all about studying the early universe. So, like, that propelled me, and the most feelings I've had in my career that were closest to what Einstein described cosmic religious feeling were the moments when I first saw the Hubble Deep Field, this dark patch of sky that Hubble stared at, or the moments when we first got the Webb telescope aligned and there was 4 a.m. and 3 of us standing around a computer screen and these first images come in and they're just full of galaxies, and it's like, oh my God, like that is the universe out there, very earliest time. And so, and I think the feeling that you get, the feeling that you describe by definition, is very analogous to what some people get when they pray, and what Martin Buber called the eternal thou experience, this
Hmm.
feeling of oneness.
Hmm.
Um, and it's a little bit about what people who are religious, what it's all about, that feeling of oneness with God, etc., that you're trying to get to, and but I think when you believe in, when you're a scientist, it's hard to exactly describe something in terms of, that God or religion, but you can describe a feeling that you get and that emotion that you get in, sensing what is out there, and your perspective relative to it.
Couple of things, and I want to get to this and our mortality in a moment. But when you were a teenager at Ramah, Camp Ramah, and looking out into the starry sky late at night, and you feel whatever it is, that feeling of awe that you felt. I mean, I've had that feeling. I'm not a scientist, but I've had that feeling in various ways, including in dreams, by the way, when I was a teenager, where I would have these dreams of like big, big books, thousand page books, and every word on every page was a tiny little word, the word the, every page, every line. And I woke up and it was like this feeling of, oh my God, it's so I'm just another the. I'm just another the the. It just made me feel very small, and my life, in a sense, both awesome and insignificant. Um, and so when you are beholding what you're beholding, like I'm thinking of that 4 in the morning moment when you were there and you finally see it. That is an historic, and I would say cinematographic moment. Someday, I hope that is in a film. Do you feel a sense of your own life as more or less, I'll put it in quotes, significance, because you are seeing um, the ancientness of the universe?
Yeah, well, you know what I think the feeling is, if you think about it, there's been a lot of life on our planet for a long period of time, from bacteria to, cells to animals. And here we are, humans, and I think the significance of it is that we can even see that we've evolved so far that we're actually at the point in time where we can see this stuff. I don't think these things that I'm talking about, thousands of people work on, and they're building on the shoulders of hundreds of thousands of people in history have figured stuff
Right.
out,
Mm.
physics and technology. So to me, it's more about, like, look how far we've come as humans,
Right.
and you know, and just a feeling of, helping humanity try and lift itself up a little bit. Which, by the way, I think is a feeling we all kind of need right now.
Mhm.
So that's the way I think of it. I think of it as, what we're really, what we're doing with these things. And artists, you look at an artist who, like Mark Rothko, these abstract pictures, very sublime abstract pictures. I think they also evoke a sense of cosmic religious feeling, and I think they're all artists and musicians who have music that kind of makes that feeling. It's all about lifting humanity up. And so I have more of that feeling. I don't feel I know I've even had my own rabbi like make a comment to me about, I think she actually said this in one of her, devars at our synagogue, but she said something about, Webb telescope making you feel insignificant. And I
Uh-huh.
was thinking to myself, no, it's the exact opposite. It's the
Wow.
exact opposite. It
Uh,
makes you appreciate how complex the universe is. Yeah.
hmm. What you're saying is like it having accomplished the feat or being part of the effort to sort of enlighten the world, that is significant, and that gives significance to all of our lives and significance to your life as someone who's worked on it. And there's that other side that I'm expressing and that your rabbi is expressing of like, oh my gosh, and like that other, I think the third part of what Einstein said, this feeling of the vanity of human existence, like in Ecclesiastes, Hakol Hevel, everything is just a vanity, everything is a vapor. And Einstein was suggesting that by looking into, by beholding the universe, we feel that like, oh my gosh, it doesn't really matter. Like nothing really matters in our lives. But you're
Yeah.
saying that that's not your
Uh,
response.
yeah, it sounds like you're describing what I would say sort of an existential feeling. I personally don't feel that way. To me, I get more of a feeling of enjoying, remarking how complex the universe is and how amazing it is. But I don't necessarily feel futile or, the sense of vanity and all that stuff. I just personally don't.
There's this great documentary, I think 5 or 6 part documentary about the Grateful Dead. I think it's called Long Strange Trip. I don't know if you've seen it.
I
Um,
have seen it.
you
Yes, I
have, it's
have
on
seen
Prime. And so Robert Hunter, the famed, wonderful lyricist of the Grateful Dead, not all, but so many of their songs, was talking about how he spent this one afternoon in London, I think, at a cafe, and he penned the lyrics for the following songs: Broke Down Palace,
it. Okay.
I think Ripple,
Oh, okay.
and one
It
and
sounds
one
like
other.
American Beauty, which is maybe their greatest album.
Right,
Right.
right. And one other Sublime song.
Mhm,
Right. I forget which one. Maybe Box of Rain.
mhm, mhm,
But anyway, he remembered penning the lyrics for 3 Sublime Grateful Dead songs. And he then remarked to the on camera, decades later, that'll never happen again. In other words, he'll never be able to do that again. Then he said, correction, it'll happen again, not to me, but to someone else. Like he was really commenting on how as time goes on, and he was talking as a old old man, that
mhm.
he doesn't have that same inspiration. And Neil Young said something similar, but this is a long time ago. He said the kind of inspiration that he had, sort of the muse that was the world to him when he was young and writing music, doesn't happen at, stopped at a certain point and probably just took on a different kind of life, different kind of method for him, his writing music. So I'm actually wondering again, you at that Ramah moment that summer as a teenager, looking up into the sky, and then you as a grown man, at 4 o'clock in the morning, at that sort of pivotal moment, does the cosmic religious feeling change? Does it become more subdued just because we are more mature and have more cares and concerns and worries and whatever happens to us as we get older? Like, what's your experience with that?
Yeah. I think it probably does get more subdued. I think when you're young and you understand things less,
Hmm.
it's even more amazing, right? And then as you start to understand, like for me, it's like, well, now I understand how galaxies possibly formed and what's their structure and all that. So it's still pretty amazing, but yeah, maybe it is a little more subdued.
Hmm.
Uh, yeah.
Yeah. Um, I used to be very, very petrified of death. I was really
Me
petrified of
too,
death.
by the way. Me too.
Were you? Well, that's what
I
I
was
wanted to
very
ask.
existential in high school, so yeah.
Uh-huh. So, I am not petrified of death anymore. I think partly because I've become very cognitive, sort of what you're saying, I think understanding things, and partly because I'm immersed in a lot of death ritual in my work. Um, what's changed for you in terms of your feeling about your mortality?
Yeah, well, let me say this. I think what got me to think about death as a kid is my father was a veterinarian and I worked in the animal hospital, and part of my job was to hold the animals when he would have to put them to sleep,
Wow.
which was pretty traumatic every time we had to do that because it makes you really see it's such a stark difference. Um, and I have to say, my entire life, I can't think of a single time in my life I've actually seen a person who is dead. You
Wow.
know,
But you've seen animals dead.
many,
Many. And this,
yeah.
to clarify, the
And
stark difference between them being alive and
yeah,
then a moment later being
yeah,
dead.
and seeing them go through the transition. So it
Mm,
really it made me think about that. Um, I think but then as you go through life, you learn about philosophy and different philosophies and Um, I think just over time you gain it probably is a very slow version of Kubler-Ross's. going through the 5 stages, of what ultimately she's describing as people with terminal, you know, issues. But really, as you go through life, you go through the stages, right? I mean, eventually you
Right.
get to acceptance. If you're lucky, late in your life, you'll be at a point of accepting, an acceptance. And I think, it's all just part of the maturation. And I think I've kind of gone through that. Earlier in my life, there was a lot, more denial and anger about death. But I think as you get older and you feel like you've lived a fulfilled life, I mean, for me, part of it is having a family, and children that I'm so proud of, and
Right.
feeling like I've accomplished things I've wanted to. So I think, I'm more, and just sort of understanding, having a philosophy about what death is. I think that helps as well. Um,
Okay. Okay. Can we talk about that?
yeah, yeah.
So I want to talk about your philosophy of what death is, your words, and also like from a physics perspective, what death is.
This may depress you a little bit from the physics perspective,
Try me.
because,
Try me.
yeah. Well, let's start with, life. What is life, right? It's actually something I've been thinking about recently, because we want to build a telescope to look for life.
Right.
And I've heard some lectures about what is it, what are you looking for when you're looking for life? There's different types of life. But just start with the fact that, the universe is made up of energy and matter, and that means there's atoms, and the atoms are made of molecules. Molecules make up things like proteins and amino acids and cells, right? And cells, really, if you really look at in terms of biology, human life is really built of cells. And these cells take in forms of energy like air and food, and that is what powers the cells. Cells are like these little machines that convert these incoming sources of energy and use that. And then the cells do things like replicate. Your DNA replicates, so you have offspring, and they allow you to walk around and do things, right? So when you die, you no longer are going through that energy conversion process with your cells. You're not bringing in food and air, right? The moment you die, you stop breathing. You don't, and the cells essentially die,
Hmm.
and they turn back into what they started with, which are individual molecules, and those things decompose, and as they decompose, we call it entropy. These things spread out in ways that are hard to bring back together, and so the energy that was you has dissipated.
Right.
Um, but but along the way, your DNA, you've been able to have offspring potentially, and DNA is sort of that process by which life kind of, as we know it, kind of gets passed to the future generation. So, you know, in some ways, if you've had children, a little bit of it, so you can think of it as sort of, if you think of life as sort of also being related to the patterns of DNA, you've passed some of that on to a future generation. And
Right.
so some of what life is about affecting the future, which I feel and you want to do it in a positive way and feel like you've lived a fulfilled life, and it could be that let me just give you an example. Maybe you're somebody who helped solve, find a new way to deal with climate change. And so you've affected future life by doing something positive in the world. Um, but you yourself, as people know you're gone.
You're
Um,
gone, and you have no consciousness after you die. Um, you are just alive, and your impact that you had that might continue after your cells break down.
it still leaves the question of a soul, right?
Right. So let's talk about the
And
soul. So
yeah,
what do you make of that concept from a, I mean, is it even a real question to say, what do you make of the concept of the soul from a scientific point of view?
yeah. So that's a great question. And I think, the immediate reaction of a scientist, I think, is, the soul doesn't really exist.
Mm.
It's just a figment of, imagination. But that implies that we actually understand the universe and physics perfectly well. Um, and there are some things that are super interesting that we don't understand, or we understand about physics that are crazy weird, which gives me just a small glimmer of possibility that there could be something deeper. So think about consciousness, right? Like, what is consciousness? Because part of it relates to the soul, right? Think about your own soul. You think about it when you're conscious. Well, there are some scientists who believe that consciousness actually, if you look at it, if you look at the brain, some of these studies show that in the neurons of the brain, there are actually these things called microtubules, which might actually use quantum processing in their logic, almost like a quantum computer, which is
Lee, micro what again? Can you say that again?
microtubules.
Tubules.
Microtubules. They're these little connections in the neurons, and there's some belief that consciousness is related to this, and that these use quantum type of operations. Now, why am I bringing that up? And why is that? What's the connection to the rest of the universe? I'm bringing it up because quantum physics has some really weird aspects to it. The most interesting, actually, is back to Einstein, which was something he called spooky action at a distance, which some people think of as like, there's this idea of you can entangle two different photons and send them off in opposite distances by really long distances, and somehow they act as a single system that can be described by a single equation. It's called non-locality, and this was actually, people won a Nobel Prize for this recently, studying this. And a lot of people for a long period of time thought there's no way the universe can be non-local, including Einstein, spooky action at a distance. God doesn't play dice with the universe. But it does seem that there's, all the experiments I've done, is that there's this non-locality to the universe.
Yeah, so you have to define the term. So non-locality, in other words, doesn't have to be close together. It need not be close together in order to be impacting and interacting with each other. Is that right?
In some subtle way, they're at a minimum, they're correlated in some way, but there does seem to be this connection that if I measure something, if I measure part A, that part B is impacted by the fact that I measured part A.
So it's just, to me, says how far away can they be?
We have, at this point, we have no limit. All the experiments we've done, as far as we've done, show that the entangled particles can stay entangled for very long distance, hundreds of kilometers, for example, as an example.
Wow.
And then, so where am I going with all this? And then the next crazy thing is that there are some physicists who have this idea of what's called a holographic universe. And what that sort of implies is the universe we know about is 3 dimensions plus time, right? Space time. That's what Einstein's whole general relativity was all about. But the holographic universe says, well, what if the universe is a little bit like a hologram? A hologram is a 2-dimensional surface, like a plate. And when I illuminate it, I get 3 dimensions. But I can describe that 3-dimensional thing with 2 dimensions. Well, if the universe is holographic, and if consciousness somehow uses quantum, which has these non-locality things, is it possible there's some physics going on that's in dimensions we can't even see, that connects us through consciousness to, and maybe that's what the soul is, right?
Hmm.
Do I think this is likely? Not really. But I think what's interesting about it is the fact that there's so much to the universe that we don't, you think we know so much about the universe, but actually there's still a lot of weirdness to quantum physics we don't understand. And
Right.
we don't know what happened before the Big Bang. And we don't, there's a lot to the universe we still don't understand. There's still a lot of physics we don't understand. In fact, 95% of the universe is dark energy and dark matter, which we don't understand.
Right.
So I still think it's possible that there's some connections that we don't understand, and maybe that's what we call the soul.
All right. Final question. When you, Lee Feinberg, as we say, ad mea stream until 120, may you live to be ad mea stream 120. But when you are slipping into your own death, what song do you want to hear?
Um, I think for me, at a point like that, it all comes back to family, and your first thought is not what song you want to hear, but just you want to be thinking about your family, and if they're there with you, it'd be amazing, and if, you have this warm feeling of family. So I think, I'm thinking to myself, like, what would evoke that sense, and also maybe evoke this kind of cosmic religious feeling. Um, you know, I think if I'm still conscious and I can hear the words, I would think of a song like Circle Game by Joni Mitchell, which is kind
Okay.
of talks about the cyclic nature of
Hmm.
things. But if I'm past that point and I just need to feel the emotions, maybe something more ethereal like Minuano by Pat Metheny or something like that. Something that just makes me feel oneness with the universe. I
That's
think
good.
that's where I'd be going.
Minuano by
Yeah.
Pat Metheny. Good
Yeah.
recommendation. Lee Feinberg, I thank you very, very much.
Thank you. I really appreciate this, Rabbi.
Many thanks to Lee Feinberg. Thanks, as always, to my creative director, editor, and my son, Sammy Weil. Thanks to my band, the Night Owls of Chicago, for the music you are listening to right now, coming to Montrose Saloon on Saturday night, November 23rd. Feel free to contact me at rabbiw14@gmail.com. And thank you for listening to Unveiling Death, Eternity in About 24 Minutes, every other Monday.